Denise, please call roll.
Deborah Neary.
Here.
Patsy Ko-Johns.
Here.
Lisa Fricky.
Here.
Maureen Nichols.
Here.
Rachel Wise.
Here.
Robin Stevens.
Here.
Patricia Tim.
Yes.
John Witzel.
Here.
Commissioner Bloomstead.
Present.
All present.
Thank you, Denise. Information regarding the Open Meetings Act is posted on the east wall of this room on the south side of the door. Live web streaming will be available through the State Board of Education website. Board members, please engage your microphones before speaking and turn them off when you are done speaking. And please turn off your cell phones at this time. Thank you very much. Commissioner Bloomstead, did you want to report on rules, sir?
Yeah, so there is on your agenda, you'll find a document there. There's 3 different rules currently still at the Attorney General's office waiting approval, I believe. So Rule 11, Rule 46, and Rule 43. Rule 11, obviously, with pre-K early childhood programs. Rule 46 related to career education partnership grants, and then Rule 53 related to special education residential care. So all of those are waiting AG approval, and then would move on from there, presuming they'd move on from there to the governor's office.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomstead. In regards to board priorities and policy research, Dr. Ford, did you want to brief the information on the NASB conference, please?
I realize we went over the consent agenda and missed that, so just a reminder on consent agenda process to go ahead and fill out the pink form if you had any questions or any items that you want to remove, and put them in front of the box for Scott. So I'm sorry.
Please.
Can I talk about yesterday's activities first?
Please.
Okay. So Drew's going to pull up slides here that are in Spark for you. So the Nebraska Army National Guard has spoken to this board before about some of their programs, and they reached out and offered an educator flight. And so you'll know that that was put out to you as an option. And so 3 board members participated in that yesterday, and a number of staff. And a lot of this was made possible by one of our staff members, Kevin Lyons, who serves in the Army National Guard as a brigadier general. And so he was very instrumental in this, along with John and their staff. And so yesterday I accompanied those 3 board members and the staff, and we went out to the Guard base out by the airport, and they briefed us on their programs, including ASVAB, and I know some of you will probably talk about that when you deliver your reports. So a lot of great opportunities for partnership there in terms of continuing to explore their programs, and so great opportunity for our staff and for you to reach out to them. I wanted to share, though, a couple of pictures from yesterday that I think are fun. And so part of this that was the draw was a ride on a Black Hawk helicopter, which was super cool. And as I was riding in that with folks yesterday, it really made me think about the technical skills that are required in lots of different occupations within the Guard and other branches of the military, and an appreciation for what these folks do for us and for our state and for our country. On a lighter note, so if you know anything about, you do know anything about, that sounds bad, right? But you know Air Force One is only Air Force One when the president's on it, or Marine One, the helicopter, is only Marine One when the president is on it. So yesterday, for the moment in time that the president and other board members were on there, that was Board Force One.
She was pretty comfortable.
Okay, now I'll get serious again. Wanted to share some information with you all, and Chair Wise, Chair of NASB, you certainly have some additional things to add to this. I wanted to share with you and remind you, of course, that the NASB conference, National Association of State Boards of Education, is coming to Omaha. We've talked about that quite a bit. Their schedule is online, and in working with Rachel Wise and with President Witzel and others, we're working to engage local, state, federal elected officials, as well as area schools. And so I'm proud to report today that we have a firm confirmation from the JROTC program at Bellevue for the color guard to present the colors at the opening session. We have requests out to other metro area schools to present the National Star Spangled Banner, as well as a jazz ensemble. And I'm not quite ready to confirm those details with you yet, but I think we'll have that shored up soon. Also, NASB's reached out to our members of Congress and the governor to speak, and we'll reach out also to the Secretary of State, the Speaker of the Legislature. The mayor of Omaha is unable to attend, but we've requested a welcome that could be included in the conference program. So those are some of those details, and I know Deborah Neary also serves on the planning committee for that. And so if there's anything else to add about the NASB conference coming up for folks here and listening to know.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank Deborah for serving on that planning. It's the first time that NASB has a planning conference committee, and it's really shaped the agenda in some different ways than in years past. And so much of the agenda is based on survey and input of discussion of what board members from across the country really want on the agenda. So this year, it's not focusing just on like who's a keynote speaker that, is in the educational circles right now, as much as what's the kind of presentations and substance that board members want to hear. And there's been discussion about hearing from what's happening in other states. And so that's really built into the conference as well. And I'd like to thank all of you, because everyone has done something in stepping up in helping to be a part of the planning conference. And I think we're creating in Nebraska a prototype for NASB going forward when a state is hosting the annual conference, how the state board steps up and plays an important part of that process to showcase some great things happening. We also are very fortunate, as you know, because we will be honoring and recognizing some of our own in this conference. So we have several folks. Molly will be recognized for her service. Nebraska Loves Public Schools will be recognized as a friend of education. So we're excited about some of those opportunities as well this year.
Also, we're talking about our local people and the things that they're doing. Dr. Sam Mizels with the Buffett Institute, who's is co-chair of our Early Childhood Commission, is going to speak.
That concludes the information I'd share.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think that Robin wants to say something, and then I cannot not thank the zoo. The Henry Durley Zoo has given us a reduced cost to do a pre-conference there, and then we'll do our opening reception there. And I have to thank Deborah Neary for her connections. That Durham Western Heritage Museum is giving us an opportunity to be in their space for our state night on Thursday.
And you are the president. That just thought we might throw that in there. Good deal.
Dr. Four, anything else, sir?
If I may then, on that second item, to talk about some changes to the agenda structure for tomorrow. And Drew, if you would bring up the computer view here. So I am looking at Friday's agenda. In conversations with Brian Halstead and Scott Summers and myself over the past couple of months, and then in working with President Witzel and Vice President Nichols in preparing the agenda, of course, along with the commissioner, we have placed the consent agenda for tomorrow at the beginning of the agenda. The purpose for that is to I'll say, get those matters out of the way earlier rather than later. That kind of takes a breath off of our staff, who are often always wondering, is something going to get pulled from the consent agenda? And so as opposed to waiting to the end to take that up, taking that up at the beginning, it doesn't change any of the processes. As you know, per board policy, you can pull any consent agenda at any item at any time. What this does is it puts it at the front. It also includes putting the minutes as part of the consent agenda. So it's actually one less time you would have to vote, because we'd be including the minutes under that. And so I want to give you a heads up to that, because that is different. You would presumably be approving the consent agenda at the beginning of the meeting tomorrow, with the minutes included in that. I want to note then that there's a lot on the consent agenda. So I'm paging through that. The approval of the agenda then for the rest of the meeting follows that. And the reason for that is because if you chose to pull an item from the consent agenda, that would fall then in the approval for the rest of the meeting. Questions on that?
Thank you, Dr. Ford. Thank you, sir. Anything else, sir?
Mm-mm.
With that presentation of Nebraska Instructional Materials Collaborative, Dr. Epler.
So as Corey comes up, first of all, we're getting our money's worth out of Ryan on his parliamentary procedure pieces, as you can see. So thanks for that. I think those are, even though they seem kind of small, actually it helps us in our processes, so thanks for doing that. And I'll turn over to Dr. Epler. I want to do a quick introduction in the sense, not so much you know him already, but I think in this work, and I think we've shared this with you in the past, but I will tell you it's created some, and we'll say Corey's recognized nationally for the work that's taking place in Nebraska. I've had a good opportunity to be involved in national level presentations within CCSSO because of this work, and so I just want to thank Corey for that effort. And by the way, we did boot him off the last agenda, so this is an opportunity to return to the board.
I only had a month to prepare, so we'll see how this goes. Thanks for the opportunity to spend just a little bit of time. More than anything, wanted to ensure that the board is aware of the work that we've been undertaking really over the last two years around instructional materials, and excited to talk a little bit about the Nebraska Instructional Materials Collaborative and what that means. As we get started, I always start presentations with just a reminder of our mission statement, because we certainly know that this work is highly connected to our mission, but also a reminder of the three goals and the strategic vision and direction of the board. And as we think about how we work to accomplish those specific goals, we know that this work is directly impacted and connects to that. I think more importantly is this conversation around a commitment to equity, and certainly we were excited last summer at Administrator Days in Kearney, where the commissioner articulated one of our commitments to equity was around high quality instructional materials and ensuring that each of our students have an opportunity to learn from high quality materials. And the work that we've been doing in this space is really seeking to provide statewide leadership to districts and to ESUs that ultimately informs and supports the decisions that districts make locally around curriculum and around instructional materials. So I just want to really highlight this as a key equity strategy within our agency. One of the things that's been interesting over the last, I would say, at least 2 years, but even looking back around 5 years, is the conversation around instruction materials has really been elevated nationally. As we think about how we hope to help students learn the content in college and career-ready standards, there's been a great deal of attention brought to light around the materials that students learn from. That could be the curriculum, it could be the textbook, it could be the assessments they use, the assignments, etc. The RAND Corporation is a group that's done quite a bit of research in this area, and their findings are somewhat I don't want to say astonishing, but they highlight some of the challenges we have in this space. Number one, we know that a significant portion of our teachers lack access to standards-aligned, high-quality instructional materials. So thinking about that, what that means is that teachers don't have access to materials that actually help students learn the content and the standards. When you couple that with the fact that districts have adopted rigorous college and career-ready standards, we see that there are gaps that exist around the type of instruction that those standards should allow for, and actually what's presented in the materials that the teachers are using. The other challenge that we see in this space is professional learning to support the implementation of those materials. It's one thing to select a set of materials that's high quality. It's another to actually think about how's it successfully implemented. From a practitioner perspective, we can think about situations where teachers have new textbooks and new curriculum, and a year and a half later it's still shrink wrapped and in the closet. And so thinking a little bit more specifically about what types of professional learning support implementation. And then when we look at it from a market perspective, we know that the quality varies across what publishers are providing and what's available in terms of their level of alignment and their quality as well. The other thing that in this space we often talk about is knowing how our teachers are spending their time, because the RAND Corporation also continues to survey teachers, and we know that teachers are spending up to 12 hours a week creating materials. And they're going online to search for instructional materials. And where they're going to Google, they're going to Pinterest, and they're going to Teachers Pay Teachers. A challenge with that is ensuring and trying to understand if those resources that they're finding are actually high quality or they're actually aligned to the standards. And I often, think about my first several years teaching, where Sunday afternoon was hard as a beginning teacher, because I was just sitting at my kitchen table hoping to find a lesson plan that would get me through to my planning period that next day. And I think that's exactly what is happening to our teachers, is many of them don't have access to high quality or comprehensive curricula, so they're spending their time trying to piece things together. And that becomes somewhat challenging from a coherence perspective when we think about how are they actually mastering the content that's in the standards. I'm not going to go through this. All of this is linked, and I included the research link from our websites. Again, just a ton of things that are coming out right now around the importance of curriculum within our system. So a couple of years ago, and the Commissioner mentioned some of the national work that we've been a part of. So Nebraska is one of 8 states that's in a network through CCSSO around instruction materials and professional development. And through this network, have convenings, and we have access to a coach and other experts that help us really think about this space and what our goals are specifically. As we have encountered this work, I want to just briefly, so I'm calling phase 1 started in the fall of 2017 through this spring. And really our work was guided by 4 questions that we were seeking to try to find answer to. Number 1 is understanding what was being used in our state as far as instruction materials for ELA and mathematics. NDE had never asked districts to share that with us before. So we didn't even have a sense of what was being used. Thinking about how we signal and communicate quality of those materials, how we support districts as they identify and select and ultimately implement high quality materials, but then thinking about how we might incentivize districts to select higher quality materials as they're seeking out new resources. Part of this work, and we always stumble on some of our terminology, is we had to define what we meant by instructional materials. So we had a group of stakeholders that first summer come together where we have definitions of how we're describing content area standards, what we mean by curriculum, and what we mean by instructional materials. This work is specifically around instructional materials, which we define as tools and resources used as part of a locally determined curriculum. So a textbook is part of a set of instructional materials. We know that there's a lot of variations in terms of how districts use these resources, so we wanted to provide some clarification around the terminology. As a result of that first phase, we developed the Nebraska Instructional Materials Collaborative, which is probably the thing that gets us the most notoriety, which is a website that links to a set of independent reviews for ELA, math, and science that are completed by an independent nonprofit called EdReports. So EdReports employs teachers to actually do the reviews of instructional materials. It takes about 150 hours for them to complete a review of a series, let's call it, and they touch every page of it. Their theory of action is really clear. They want to improve the market for educators. But through this, we've been able to capitalize upon them because as much as we might want to do our own reviews, capacity and funding, et cetera, is somewhat challenging, and there's a national resource that exists, so we utilized EdReports. So the Nebraska Instruction Materials Collaborative includes those independent reviews of materials for English language arts, math, and science. We also provide guidance around selection processes, because we know that the selection piece of that is a very small part. We also want to make sure districts are thinking about policy. So do districts actually have clear policy in place around how they select their instructional materials? I'll say some do and some don't. So part of our work is also helping ensure that districts are thinking about timelines for selecting materials and processes as well. I offer this just as a quick example of what you'll see once you go to that website. These are 3 different English language arts curricula. And EdReports uses a green, yellow, and red. Green signals that it meets the expectations for alignment for that grade level. So you can see that top one, it says kindergarten, first, second grade. You click on the Learn More from our website, and it takes you to the very comprehensive review by EdReports. Yellow means it partially meets, and red means it does not meet expectations. We think it's important to note that this reflects reviews to standards that are not Nebraska standards. So we've created some bridge documents that allow us to go from Nebraska standards back to the EdReport reviews, because we want to make sure that folks feel comfortable like that. We're not telling districts that you can't pick a red or that you should only pick greens. We still want them to have that local flexibility, but this informs their process and allows them to make smarter decisions as they're making those selections, which has been really important. So one of the questions we ask is, what do we know about the state of instructional materials in Nebraska? I'm going to show you just a snapshot, but I'm going to go back to remember the green, yellow, red. This is a summary based on 2018-2019 data from 183 districts. The top is English language arts. The bottom is mathematics, and it's broken out K5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. So there's a lot of red, there's a lot of yellow, there are a few greens. I think that this means that we've got some work to do to continue to communicate to districts the quality of their materials that they're using. You'll notice there are some asterisks up there. That means that EdReport has not reviewed that, and if they have not reviewed that specific one, it means they do not consider it a comprehensive curriculum. I'll mention reading mastery. We have a great deal of districts using reading mastery as their core. It's primarily an intervention. So again, how do we communicate what a strong core looks like within the space of this work? So we're collecting the data right now. I expect this year it's going to look better. I expect in 2 years even better. In 3 years, it's just going to be really, really exciting to see where we're at. What's interesting when we start to look at this data, and I remember sharing this with Dr. Friesen about a year ago, so we can think about our students statewide that have access to high quality materials, but when we look at students of color, low income students, and English learners, we know that a very small percentage of those students have access to high quality instructional materials. So we're making gains in those areas as we provide support to districts, but from an equity lens, this is something that's really important to consider, that some of our students that are historically marginalized may not even have opportunities to learn from high quality materials. So we see this as a really important equity consideration. I'm not going to spend much time here, but you can go in and take a look at our Phase 2 goals, which started this spring and clear to 2021. Again, I'm really interested in thinking about how we continue to provide support to districts, not only in selection but implementation. Through this network, we have access to funding, and so that's been really great as well. Not only funding through the network, but they have connections to additional funds that have supported the work also. And thankfully, with the commissioner's leadership, I will say that Nebraska has gotten some attention in this space because it's so new for us, but we're just making some really significant strides forward as well. A few things I want to point out at the end is this certainly has a strong connection to MTSS, and unfortunately I wasn't able to be out in Kearney this week, but we do know that there is a very strong connection to strong core instruction as it relates to MTSS. We're continuing to have a consistent message that intervention should supplement, not supplant core instruction, and that when you improve core instruction for all students, that includes students with disabilities and our English learners as well. We want to make sure that teachers of students with IEPs and ELs are included in this core professional learning and providing additional support to help districts select appropriate interventions based on the needs of what their students are requiring. And the last thing I'll talk about is a connection to OER. So we've talked about our Open Educational Resource Hub. The thing that's interesting about OER is that there are some highly rated instruction materials that are fully scoped and sequenced that are open. And a couple examples I put up there from English Language Arts EL Education. It's a free curriculum from Open Up Resources and Eureka Math. We have a pocket of districts in ESU 10 moving towards Eureka Math. So the curriculum itself is open. Then they're actually able to spend the money on professional learning and providing support. So it's exciting to see districts start to consider some of these curricula that are open. We do have a couple of districts right now that have selected and will utilize EL education as well. So I'm going to just end with this. This is from the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools and her commitment to equity as it relates to curriculum, and just saying that if we're really committed to equity, there needs to be a far more thoughtful approach to curriculum and ensuring that we're providing the appropriate supports to our students. So I will take questions or...
Dr. Wise.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. I do appreciate what you're doing in this arena and stuff. And I think one of the things that I would like to see as we move forward is coming back with really the focus on curriculum prior to instructional materials. I mean, we just, in our committee, just had a discussion and realized, one of the priority districts that we've been working with adopted, in fact, one of our highly rated materials, but they didn't do the curriculum work. Now they're having to backtrack to do that curriculum work. And, as a committee, we discussed that curriculum work becomes so important. If it's not there, but you do select high quality instructional materials, if you have not done the work to see that there's a curriculum mapped out, then you may not be getting the impact of those materials in an effective way. And I think that's where it's important for us to make sure we lead with that modeling of how you develop a high quality curriculum. And if it's a matter of selecting, if there's one that's even selected as an example, that may be a direction to go.
Mm-hmm.
So at least schools are moving to that step before they do the selection of high quality instructional materials. I just think that gap continues to be there, and we saw it here recently as well.
And what we're finding in some of the newer materials that are coming out is they're doing that for the districts. So it's coming out as a fully scoped and sequenced curriculum with all the appropriate assessment supports, all of the appropriate resources. So I think that's part of the challenge too, is that some districts have used the textbook as their curriculum, but some of the shifts in the market over the last couple of years specifically has really been to create these turnkey resources and then providing that additional professional learning for success with implementation of it.
Thank you, Dr. Rapper.
I'm just going to add, I think part of the national conversation, Nebraska, being among those states that doesn't dictate, content and materials to school districts, and there's other states that actually in that network that do, right? That they actually do that whole selection piece. And I think the point around, we're actually looking for places that don't have sufficient capacity. And I think even on the curriculum side, it's how do we begin to do that? What's that role? And building that from an instructional material standpoint allows us to start thinking about how we work with our ESUs in those places that are otherwise not maybe have a written curriculum. How do we start to shape professional development to actually have those key processes in place? And that's my hope in this work, so.
And just to add to that, I think states have done that where they've also developed curriculum that's not mandatory, but they have a curriculum guide that's available. And it's kind of the model curriculum guide, so that if for whatever reason they don't have access to the development process, or they're not in a larger district where the development process occurs, they can go out and access that guide to then move forward with the material selection process.
Absolutely.
So,
Thank you. Oh.
and I just might add, just as I'm reflecting back on the last couple of years of kind of work on this, when we actually did those surveys, it wasn't all well received, because school districts started to ask, well, are you going to start dictating these things? And so it's been an interesting learning experience, I think, on those fronts, but I think you're entirely right. How do we now use this opportunity to build capacity for schools across the state, including what we do and provide? So
I'll leave a couple of the cards with the website address
Thank you.
there too.
Yes, ma'am. Excuse me, Corey.
Oh.
Maureen has a quick question.
Now, did I understand you to say that ESU 10 is already doing some of this?
There are pockets. So one of the high-quality materials for mathematics, Eureka Math, ESU 10 has several districts that are moving towards that or are already using it. So that's actually one thing that was exciting this summer. They hosted a professional learning on the curriculum itself. And it's a bit of a paradigm shift to help districts understand why what I might call curriculum agnostic professional learning only gets you so far. So what their intent was in that is, how do we actually help you successfully implement this high quality set of materials? But yes, and it's exciting, and I might mention the ESU CC is a partner in the Nebraska Instruction Materials Collaborative, as is the Nebraska State Literacy Association too. So we've worked to try to ensure others have a voice and a part in this as well.
And the Eureka map can be downloaded, no cost to districts.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
Now we'll turn to the State Leadership Playbook. Commissioner Bloomstead.
yeah, so I want to just give a quick update, but actually, while it's not on the agenda, but I want to, since we're talking a little bit about equity, and I know many of you already know Zainab Rita, but Zainab started as our equity officer officially this week. You'll see her office is right close to, right behind this wall now, and has just started. So Zainab was kind enough to start exploring what that might look like. I felt like, given our work around equity, having someone that's in a position to be able to kind of wake up every day thinking about how we improve those processes. I know we will spend quite a bit of time, and Zainab will be quite engaged in some of the work that I know you talk about even later today. But I just wanted to welcome her into this new role, and among the other things, how that ties back to, I think, your strategic plan, but also really our commitments to equity. So I wanted to make that announcement while I was thinking of it. I might have missed my opportunity otherwise. So the State Leadership Playbook as well. So first of all, thanks for your input last time, and I'm sorry that we caught anyone off guard on the playbook itself. But thanks for providing some input, and I know some of that's come to Maureen. What I want to be able to do, and I think what we kind of collectively want to do, is kind of gather up that information and figure out what questions do we have, and what's a thoughtful strategy for us to do this. I want to kind of back up just even a little bit more. My hope, we're kind of at what I would call a stable moment for the board. And what I mean by that is we're not right in the middle of an election year. We're not trying to rush into that. 2 new board members this year. I can't count you as new anymore. But it's really our chance to think about how we continue to build the understanding what the board role is and where we go forward and how we do some particular work, I think, is important. So I actually appreciate the conversations about, okay, is exactly what's in this playbook. It should be fluid enough to be responsive to what you want. That's definitely one of the things we want. I also, even as we do other work, and I know we've got on the agenda today, I mean, where the Budget Finance Committee is starting to explore where we go with the deficit request for the budget, where we go from the legislative committee relative to what's our message with all those things. There's a lot of things that I hope we're able to tie together really underneath the great work on the strategic plan to make sure those things are pretty consistent in our messaging. And I think that's the exercise that I hope to keep doing around the playbook, having those conversations. There's probably other resources we need, so don't get me wrong, and that's the end of it, and it all shows up there, but it gives us a chance to look at that. Actually, equity lens, as I think of it, there's just a lot of other things that become key parts of our processes going forward. And I appreciate your input, your thoughts, as we continue to kind of build out those resources and move us forward. And so, I don't know exactly what all the next steps might be, how we time out all those conversations, but I do want us to have those conversations about what's our work, how do we best do that, and that's the intention, I think, with the next steps on the playbook effort.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Standing committee reports. Patricia Tim, please report on policy committee meeting, please.
The policy committee has 2 action items for this month. The first one is to adopt the proposed revisions to State Board Bylaw B16 regarding board member expenses. This particular bylaw had been monitored through the last legislative session because of potential action which did not end up being passed. The policy committee recommends that the state board adopt the revisions with the addition of a cross-reference to the Nebraska Constitution, which does give us some information about our board expenses at our business meeting tomorrow, and we recommend adoption. The second action item is to adopt the proposed revisions to State Board Position Statement S1, Non-Discrimination and Equitable Educational Opportunities in Schools. The Policy Committee discussed the proposed revisions recommended by the Student Success and Access Committee. The proposed additions, consistent with the definition of what a board position statement is, are primarily aspirational and belief statements of where this board stands on the topic of equal education opportunities. The Policy Committee recommends that the State Board adopt the revisions with one non-substantive change, replacing the word equal with equitable to be consistent throughout the S1 policy at our business meeting tomorrow. In October, we will bring forth State Board Bylaw B11, which has to do with legal assistance, and this will be just for reaffirmation. We're not making any changes. Thank you.
Any questions for Patricia? Seeing and hearing none. Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much. Vice President Nichols, please report on the legislative committee meeting, please.
Yes, we have one action item tomorrow, and that is to take action on our 2019-2020 legislative and regulatory priorities. And should we take action on it to adopt these, then it will become a public document. So that's our main piece of action for tomorrow. I'm asking Brian Halstead, our legal counsel and deputy director, is that what he calls? To share with us some information. Board member Stevens sent me a question earlier in the week dealing with, we have early childhood education listed twice in our document. And what really is the difference? Because one is under legislative priorities, the other one is listed under regulatory priorities. And so my information back to Robin was as thick as mud. So, I asked Brian to share with the committee today, what the real reasoning behind, what the rationale was, so that we all better understood. And, because of Deb Neary being newer on the board as well, I asked him to, share with everyone why it's listed on there twice and what the difference is. So, Brian, it's all yours, you're the guru.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Brian Halstead, Deputy Commissioner, or whatever you want to call me. That's fine.
Commissioner?
Whatever you want to call me. So in the sense of, actually, this goes back to after the state board adopted the strategic vision and direction. There was the from and to, but it was also members of the state board's legislative committee realizing we had to change how that committee worked. At the time of the strategic plan, the board largely just reacted to bills introduced by senators in the legislature. And to move from that to actually setting forth priorities that needed to be done in legislation, they decided they needed to identify the top priorities that this board felt were necessary. At the same time, they realized, wait a minute, because you're a constitutional entity that's already been granted the power of the general supervision and administration of the school system of this state, you as a board legislate all the time when you're dealing with regulations in the rules of the Department of Education. So the document you have in front of you speaks to everybody about what are the legislative priorities, the first 2 pages speaking primarily to the legislature that you believe are the needs of that body to address those topics. And the last page actually speaking to the public about, and to yourselves, about what you need to address as legislation through rules and regulations that you wanted to see addressed in the same time frame. So in that regard, the document serves dual purposes. It lets the legislature and others know these are top issues from the board. It also lets the public know the board believes they need to change regulations, the law that you legislate in those categories. And in some cases, the same topics are in both because some take a legislative change and others take a regulatory change of the state board. So I think it was a prime example of a from to owning leadership on legislation, not only trying to get bills introduced or have topics addressed, but also where you felt you needed to go forward on your own legislation and rules and regs. So that's kind of the context of the document you have before you, and hopefully you'll adopt tomorrow.
Deb
Any
Neary.
questions for Brian? Yeah?
Thank you. And because I'm new, are these the priorities on behalf of the board, or this is the agency's priorities?
Well, the document is the board as the policy forming body for the education system, speaking for that whole system.
Okay, but there was staff input,
Oh,
right?
but
Like-
staff is,
okay.
and others have had input into it,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, and so,
Yeah.
okay. And then, the legislative priorities, do we initiate conversation, or, sorry, just short answer, I don't need the long answer, but,
Well, some of that is about actually engaging in our relationship with others to see if they would or others are going to, or giving some direction, because we are well aware there are a number of groups out there that we work with all the time who ask senators to introduce bills on their behalf. So some of these items, if you look at the document, you'll see several budget issues in there that were part of your biennium budget that was submitted over a year ago that are still sitting there. So it can play both roles. Some of it may be the staff and others here working on potential legislation, but it also lets your policy partners know these are hot topics that you think the legislature needs to address so that they can actually look at it and try to work with the legislature and also with you on the regulatory changes about what needs to be done.
Rachel?
I'd just like to make an example from this to our committee, the Strategic Planning and Performance Improvement Committee. When you look under regulatory priorities of the accountability and accreditation, that's very similar, the proposal for next year as for this year. And that's really guided, that definition in those two bullets really guide a lot of the work and discussion that we have been engaged in as it relates to Rule 10, that includes both accreditation and accountability, but it's also now brought in for discussion Rule 14, approval, and we'll report out on some of that later, but this document helps set the stage for the work of that committee in trying to make sure we are responsive to what the legislative committee said are some priorities. So that's where this document helps guide the work of different committees from the two, or the regulatory aspect of this document. Things that we have the ability to change or control, not things that we need to have changed or controlled by someone else. And the first one is one that the committee has been very involved with.
I might just add, I think it's a really advantageous document for us as staff as well. So as not just on the regulatory side, we're able to look at this and say, hey, look, this is clearly work that we're going to do. So when we're communicating with, certainly school officials or post-secondary institutions or ESUs, wherever it may be, it's like, hey, look, clearly this is work we're going to do. But also on the legislative side, engaging with our partners from a policy standpoint, it's able to say, hey, look, this is really important work. So it's actually a great conversation starter. I think that's been our experience with this over time. It helps us engage in conversations. People might ask, even if something wasn't clear to them in this, they at least know a topic area that's really important to the state board. And I will say, even though it's the board adopting it, it does become the agencies too. So I mean, I see us as one and the same, and I think that's been a lot of important work for us too.
Patsy?
I'll be short with this, but in reverse, it also focuses state board members as they communicate with their representatives. It's what you want to be talking about, what you want to be focusing on, so that maybe we're all sort of saying the same thing on the same line, so that they know where we stand and what we think.
Anyone else? I would just like to add, if you think back to last month, we had a document that Brian had put together of all of the bills that we took positions on this last year as a board. And he had marked, I believe it was in red, the ones that actually were addressed in the legislature this year. And there were a lot more than what we thought initially. And so, but that was last month. And so there was one or two topics that we took off of our priority list when we went back through for this next year, because of the action that took place in the legislature this last year, that we just, last session, that we just didn't really realize until Brian put it all together and showed us. So thank you, Brian. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Vice President. Thank you very much, ma'am. Commissioner's Appraisal, Patricia Tim. Please report on the Commissioner's Appraisal Committee meeting.
Our committee meeting will be held tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and so I'll have a few words for you tomorrow afternoon or during the business meeting.
Thank you, ma'am. Lisa Fricke, please report on the AQuESTT Teaching and Learning Domain Committee meeting, please.
Yes, sir.
Microphone.
Sorry about that. We had some really good discussion this morning. Corey Epler and Stephanie Call brought the world language standards before the committee a few times before, and they're ready to ask us to approve them tomorrow as an action item. And that was 3.4A. 3.4B, Corey Epler and Lacey Peters provided an update about the early stages of the Nebraska Health Education Standards development, and we'll continue to discuss that as a committee over time. And that won't be up for approval for quite some time. The next item, Corey gave us an update on early literacy position statement. The committee recommends that this be taken to the policy committee next month as an action item. And then two parts, 3.4D and 3.4E. Brad Dirksen gave us an update about possible changes to Rules 21 and 24. Part of our discussion was around the Jobs for America graduates, known as JAG, a JAG endorsement. And Commissioner, would you please say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think based on what I understand was discussed in the committee, I think it's useful to give a little bit of background information for you about JAG, or Jobs for America's Graduates. So it actually, this opportunity really kind of presented itself in some partnership with Department of Labor, and actually I think Economic Development was involved in conversations at that point in time. But it actually ended up being a program Iowa has used for a long time. Iowa, by the way, has the nation's top graduation rate, and I think Nebraska's second. I don't like being second, so therefore we'll model some things I think there. But there was actually some interactions that allowed us to look at this particular program. Well, this program actually is really set up to identify schools and students within schools that have an opportunity to explore, do career exploration, to further understand kind of a pathway to what types of career opportunities they want, what types of employment opportunities they want, and it's really, at least in Iowa, and I've got a little bit of a kind of a one-liner, and because we're modeling it so much off of Iowa right now, this probably describes it pretty well. But it's really through JAG programs, and actually in Iowa they still actually tie these into college programs, but also at the high school and middle school level, students are able to discover their individual talents, develop skills, and seize opportunities to achieve their personal potential. And then each program is operated as a 4-credit elective course for students, really around learning experiences, thinking about how they can partner with different potential employers and communities, and creating some models. So when we were approached really by the Department of Labor, having a chance to say they had some funding, they were interested in seeing if a pilot program would be possible, they called and asked me and said, do you think you have any schools that might be interested? And so they said they had funding to make this at least in 3 schools, or at least we ended up with 3 schools anyway. So Columbus High School, Fremont High School, and Omaha Nation in Macy were all 3 pilots. And I think in each case, we've had very positive results. Now, the opportunity also created an environment where, like with our career education permit, so often we'd have like a technical trade and we might fill a void in a school with a career education permit. When we started looking at this from a pilot standpoint, it didn't require necessarily that the JAG teacher would actually have a teaching certificate. But we looked at it going, is this very similar to what we've done on career education permits, and created a process where we could explore that and be able to say, hey, look, if the schools can find the right people for this JAG program, that we could make it possible that they could position that person to be in offering that course at that school. We've had very good success in those 3 places, and I don't know if we're able to pull this off, but I'd actually be kind of tempted to bring in Fremont or Omaha Nation or Columbus to actually give you a little bit more background. But they're very excited about what this did for their students as far as offering them this chance to be engaged, and not so much in a specific career area, but in kind of a facilitated environment where they can explore careers, where they can actually explore employment opportunities, where they can explore different things around leadership. And I think we've had very good success with it. The rural idea is, instead of leaving it kind of in this pilot phase, how do we actually make this part of the JAG piece of that that career education permit, how do we actually make that explicit in it? So I know, and I believe, I probably will misquote this because I wasn't in there, but I think Brad Dirksen, who's leading that, I believe we'd end up with, and I don't know if you want to correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, so expecting to have a hearing on those rules in the middle of October. So we actually have one more chance at a board level if you had additional questions at the October meeting about this particular work and where we go. I think there was some perception that, hey, look, this would count for core curricular offerings. It doesn't. It just counts as an extracurricular, or excuse me, not extracurricular, but an elective type of course for students, similar to what other perhaps career exploration might count for within a school setting.
I think it would be very useful for us to have one of those schools come in and give us an example or examples of that, so we actually get a feel for what happens in that school with that program. And so if you can make that possible before.
Yeah, we'll explore it. I know it was just kind of an idea we tossed around just since your committee meeting, so, you know, all the schools, I don't know if any of them watching, but we'll probably reach out and see if that's a possibility for them. I can tell you, and I mean, I don't think, like Mark Shepard, who specifically called me at one point, said this has been really great for Fremont and a really great opportunity, and I would love to have him or others come present that. So.
Yeah, I think from this morning's discussion, the piece that was not clear that is now clear was that credit-bearing process and what really is a part of this program. And in our discussion earlier today, there was a little lack of clarity on whether or not there would be credit-bearing courses towards graduation that were in core areas, like English or math or science or something such as that. And I think where the committee, and at least for myself, you know, we feel strongly that alignment with content standards in those core areas and our certification processes are really important. And so we wanted full transparency in understanding, you know, what is it about JAG. And I think the difference I'm hearing is that JAG is more about a course than it is a program or an alternative program. That students are still in a general education program, receiving all of their core requirements. This is for students who maybe haven't figured out an elective pathway. Maybe they haven't found a talent in the arts yet, or an interest in the arts yet. Maybe they haven't found a talent in engineering or an interest, but it's really developing that deeper interest in those career areas is what I'm now hearing.
Yeah.
And that exploration process that might include some sort of kind of work job shadowing, work experiences, some of the soft skill development as a part of the course. And I think those things were a little different than what our understanding was earlier today in the committee. So
yeah, and
helps to
I will
clarify it.
send you some information, because even quickly, I mean, there's a national model for this. Many states that have been involved in it. Iowa's really kind of been recognized as among the leaders of how they've rolled it out, and I think it made good sense to try to, you know, kind of work with them. So they've been part of the guidance for each one of these schools that are involved in Nebraska, and I'm actually, I think it's much more as Rachel describes. I mean, it's in this course setting. It's not replacing what students would otherwise be doing. It is pretty typical to see in middle schools right now some type of exploration courses along those lines, some types of leadership courses sometimes in those settings. And so I think it's a great opportunity for schools, and I actually would very much look forward and appreciate having someone who's gone through that this year or this past year in Nebraska be able to present that to you probably much more effectively than I can. So, but I will share the stuff that's just available on the internet and get that off to you, so you can actually look at that, and presumably we'll be able to find someone to come share a little more next month.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you,
Thank you
Commissioner.
very much.
Maureen, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned the pilot programs were last year. Are they continuing them this year?
Yes, they are. So those are continuing, and I'm not 100% sure, but there was some talk of being able to expand that, and I don't know if that happened or not, but we'll double check that for next month too.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for the explanation and the extra information for our understanding. Jeremy Henniger gave a report update about the innovation of NSCAS, and he told us about a lot of input that he's had from educators, and some great things are happening. And so we want to thank Jeremy for that information. And that concludes my report, sir.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much, ma'am. Next, we'll go on to Patsy Coe-Johns. Please report on the AQuESTT Student Success and Access Domain Committee meeting.
Well, this committee has 2 action items. The first one, 3.5A, is a resolution to recognize September as Attendance Awareness Month and commence the Nebraska Everyday Counts campaign. And that draft was presented to this group at last month's meeting. And today, Lane Carr is coming up. I don't know if you're being joined by your partner, Shirley Vargas, or not, but we'd be glad to have one or both of you to remind us of the information, and their enthusiasm was recognized, so that's why we're having them do it.
Hi again, good afternoon. We are here just again to put on the map and continue to iterate the importance of student attendance and the reduction in chronic absenteeism, and getting to the root cause as to what could potentially be causing this. And we have materials. We want to make sure that we continue to promote daily attendance, as well as putting systems in place to ensure that each and every child is present every day, because their education matters.
We're really excited for the opportunity to have you put a stake in the ground around chronic absenteeism with this resolution tomorrow, and then really have that serve as a kickoff for sharing out those resources that we've put together to help clarify around terminology. What do we really mean by chronic absenteeism? Why are we even talking about it, and why is it so important? Why is it an equity issue? We know that in Nebraska, 36,000 students miss or are chronically absent, and that disproportionately affects students of color, the economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, and English learners as well. So we really want to put some emphasis on this, and then more importantly provide supports to our schools on what does it look like to reduce that chronic absenteeism. So excited to start a conversation and really kick that off tomorrow.
Any items just any discussion, opinions that you guys would like to express about this?
I'm excited about it.
If you haven't taken a look at their materials, you should look at their materials. They're absolutely wonderful. So it looks like this group is supporting. So the committee recommends that we approve this resolution with fervor tomorrow.
With fervor.
Thank you. 3.5B is the action item, the second action item to be presented, and it is the resolution to accept the Nebraska equity lens. And we've been working on this quite a while. Before I go into the lens itself and the history of it, I'd really like to thank my committee members. This has been a labor for the last year, more than a year actually. So it involves people from the past that are no longer here, and it involves my new members on my committee and our president as well. I'd say it really kicked up the last 6 months. We really got busy and pushed it. Now, I also would like to thank the policy committee for passing it to us so that we could make sure that there was consistency between those 2 items, the lens and the policy, and that really helped. So thank you to your committee, Pat. For me, it has been a labor of love for the past year and a half. I started working with a group called LEAP through NASB and traveled around the United States and brought this idea back to our board. Equity has always been important to me in my teaching career, and so when I brought it back and showed them the first equity lens, I think there was a lot of confusion and misunderstanding of what that was. the lens itself that we were given as an example was rather vague, and it's certainly grown over the last few years. But as I traveled and listened to other people across the United States, I realized how important this would be for Nebraska, and I really wanted us to lead with it. And then our commissioner stepped up and made that even more evident to me by declaring the Year of Equity last year. And so I thought, ooh, this is great, we're in. And so it's gone through several iterations through the last year and a half, and I think what we're presenting to you is a forerunner of what maybe other states might want to model. And so it is a fluid document. We know that marginalized people of today might not be marginalized in the years to come, or we may have to add more people to the equity lens to make it truly equitable for the people that we're working with in education. So the purpose of the equity lens is for us to have in front of us and to look at as we make decisions as leaders in education in Nebraska. And since we all do not have the same life experiences, an equity lens helps us go through a logical thinking process so that we don't think that our experience is the only experience that we should be considering when we're making choices for education in Nebraska. I think that the equity lens can be used not only by our board members. I think that'll be really important for us to have that in front of us. And we cited many examples in our discussions of how that could be used. And if you've not ever been poor, it's pretty hard to imagine what that must feel like, to not have enough food or not know where you're going to live or sleep that night. But if you're looking at an equity lens, it forces you to think about those situations, those students, those people that are forced to do that in their lives because of situations. And so I'm hoping that the equity lens that we've worked on and that we've created will not only be used by this board, but maybe by other boards and maybe by other facets of education, so that we truly speak for all students and all teachers and all workers in education, and we learn to carefully consider all the things that they may have experienced in their lives before we make decisions that might have unintentional effects on their lives. So this draft was presented last month at the meeting, and I'm now open for any questions or comments or discussion. Yes, Pat.
Well, thank you for spending the time on it, because, you know, it was kind of coincidental that we were talking about the non-discrimination policy. And I think, again, as you said, it gave us the opportunity. We've talked about this with AQuESTT and the language there. We've talked about the language and policy and also with what you were doing. And it is consistent now. And there are no, that doesn't mean that things won't change, you know, in the coming years. And as you said, things will perhaps, other things will need to be included or subtracted or whatever. But it's really nice to see across the department and our documents that the language is consistent.
Thank you, Pat, for your support. Anybody else? Deb?
I want to thank everybody on the committee. I want to thank your leadership and initiation of this discussion. But all the committee members who I've grown from listening to your questions and the discussion, and I've learned a lot, and it was just such an amazing experience, and I'm very proud of the work and the importance of it. And yes, I will definitely use it as I look at policies and, you know, try to remember that, you know, my background is not the same as everybody's, and I do need to think a little bit bigger than myself. So thank you for leading that, Emery.
Very appreciative of your contributions too, Deborah. Thank you. Anybody else? So, the committee recommends with fervor accepting the equity lens tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Patsy Jones. Thank you very much. I will report on the Budget and Finance Committee meeting. First, I'd like to acknowledge the, if you will, actively engaged members of the Budget and Finance Committee, Deb Neary, Robin Stevens, and Pat Tim. Thank you very much for your leadership. It's a pleasure working with you. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the seasoned professionals in NDE to be Bryce Wilson and Gene Uttermark. So thank you very much to both of them for their just undying support of our mission here. In regards to discussion items, we had one, and it was the deficit budget issues. The committee was briefed on the deficit budget process, including the timeline and the board's role. The deficit budget process is the annual process provided to the department to make budget requests that are considered by the Appropriations Committee of the legislature. The Budget and the Finance Committee then discussed several ideas around the upcoming deficit budget request that will be coming up to the full board for approval next month. Deficit request ideas discussed covered funding needs of the department that have been funded or were unknown when the biennial budget was submitted last fall. The committee provided feedback on the proposed items that will be taken into consideration for the version of the deficit request through the full board for discussion and approval next month. Any questions? Seeing and hearing none, the board will take a 10-minute break.
Good. Made it 10.
Report on the Strategic Planning, Performance,
Thank
and
you.
Improvement Committee, please.
Thank you, President Witzel.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I'm going to start by kind of going through our items for discussion and then give a report, kind of a committee report right at the end of
Yes,
some
ma'am.
other things that came into play, as opposed to start out with a committee report. And the first thing, we do have 3.7.A as an action item, and I'd like Shirley to come up a minute as I just talk a little bit about this. This is what we've not planned in much
Oh, this
depth.
is great.
But we are going to be not having this as an action item this month. This is an item we're going to move for action next month in October. And one of the things that the committee did, and I'd like to thank Shirley and all of the NDE team in this process, the committee is Maureen, Patsy, Lisa, and myself. We went to Santee on either physically or virtually on Tuesday for the debriefing by the Santee team and the NDE team on their progress plan. And we as a committee, I think, would all concur and recommend going forward. We think that's a great step. In the past, the team, the NDE team and the priority school team have come here and presented at the committee level, and then they've kind of hung around all day and then come back to the work session and presented. This change really gave us an opportunity to be in the school environment for the presentation. So if they had additional people, it was more of a convenience for them, which is important in that process. And I think it gave us a chance, as no different than any other committee meeting, to have that engaging discussion about the plan. But it also gave a chance to talk about some things that I think from both a board, a department, and the school team were kind of like, aha, maybe we'll make this tweak or this adjustment. So because of those discussions and that change in process, we are proposing to bring the plan next month rather than this month. Shirley, do you have anything to kind of add to our adventure on Tuesday?
It was really great. The team was really excited to have their board representative as well as the other members present, and allowed them an opportunity to really showcase the work that they're engaging in this year and express like the hopefulness and excitement.
So for this month, that action item will not be on the agenda. We'll move it for next month. So thanks,
Great,
Shirley,
no
and
problem.
thanks again to the team for being a part of that process and change in process. The next item, 3.7.B, is a discussion item, and Lane is going to come up, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on this item. Lane does have a presentation to share with us, and we want to make sure that as a full board, we have time to ask any questions of Lane, because this really is mapping out our next steps around AQuESTT classification and the processes that are coming forward quickly in the next few months. So Lane, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you and good afternoon again to you all. And I'm excited to be able to speak with you about our AQuESTT classification that is occurring this fall very soon. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to be before you here at the September meeting, is that this time next month we will have some classifications. So wanted to make sure that you were equipped with just a high level knowledge of the indicators that go into our accountability system and that classification that is now annually occurring. We'll talk about the levels of support and what that looks like, and really get down to the why of the classification system, and then share with you just a high level the timelines for the classification in 2019 and leave room for any questions. So like Dr. Epler, I also like to start with the mission of the department as well as our 3 strategic goals. And specifically, I think that this third one around an education system and the department taking charge of the role and responsibility, I think is absolutely key here. So as we get to just thinking about a high level of why do we even have an accountability system, First and foremost, it's a federal and a state requirement, but I really like to focus on the other bullets here in that it sets a standard for all of our schools and really ensures that we can focus the funds for improvement. And really, Shirley, and I'm so glad to have Dr. Vargas on our team as thinking about differentiated supports. And so our accountability system, our AQuEST system, is really thinking about how do we differentiate, intensify, and focus supports to schools? How do we think differently about what each school needs? And really that's what our AQuEST data is part of. It's one slice of the picture that is occurring in a school. And then really importantly, I think that our AQuEST system provides a framework for school improvement. So very smartly, our board put together a system of support and a classification system that is called AQuEST. And it's, depending on who you ask, is about at its 5th anniversary or birthday. So it's a fun time to be in the work thinking about the enhancements we want to make. But really we're focused on the right now and what's upcoming. So one of the key things, one of the big areas that I want you to be empowered with for if constituents call you or if anybody reaches out and asks you what goes into a classification. Well, these are the indicators that are used in our accountability system. And I provide just a rough definition from our colleagues at CCSSO for what an indicator even is. And it's about a student achievement measure or a different element that is about how that may influence those gains. And then I really like the idea of providing a rich picture of school performance. And so to do that, we have the following indicators that you can see on the PowerPoint here. The first two are really around a student achievement on NSCAS assessment and on the ACT for that 3rd year cohort or the junior class that now takes that. So we look at our students proficient, and that is what we call status. We then say, well, if they're not proficient, are they at least making progress? And we have 3 separate measures for progress in here. And we also include science achievement and science growth in these progress measures. For our high schools, we have graduation rate. And again, unique to Nebraska is that we include an extended year graduation rate in our calculations. So our students, by the Constitution, have the right to a free education until age 21. And so we actually allow schools that 7-year graduation rate, which incentivizes and signals, as Corey was saying earlier today, that signaling that we want you to stick with those students. And we'll give you some credit for that higher graduation rate in the 7-year graduation cohort. New last year, we included progress toward English language proficiency. So each English learner in the state takes the test called the ELPA 21, which is around a student's proficiency in reading, writing, speaking, and listening in English. And we want to really highlight that this is about a student's progress towards meeting those proficiency standards. It's not where they are at one set time. So we're looking at our schools growing the proficiency for those students in those areas. Importantly, timely, as we just finished talking about chronic absenteeism, we also wanted to share that chronic absenteeism is part of our accountability system. And that once again, we're not looking at, do you have a high level or a low level of chronic absence? We're looking at, are you consistently lowering that level of chronic absence over time? And then the last piece here is the evidence-based analysis, which is a self-reported survey that schools go through each year. All schools go through the evidence-based analysis, and then we've added another step, which I actually highlight just a little bit on this next slide, which talks about some of the extension of the time that it takes for us to provide a full classification for all of our schools. So as we mentioned, or as I mentioned, the EBA is a survey that each school submits from January to June. And then what we do is we look at the EBA and we provide an opportunity for about 10% of our schools to go through an additional step whereby they can provide us information that says, hey, we're doing these things that are making progress or could lead to progress for our students. So our schools submit up to us evidence, and then an independent panel of NDE, ESU, and school and district personnel then review that evidence and ultimately say, yeah, this school has the pieces that they've told us, and they should receive that classification adjustment. So I do want to note that this EBA process adds time to our classification timeline, but we really feel like we've done a lot of things this year to speed that up a little bit. So we've helped our schools by providing examples and exemplars of this is what quality evidence might look like. And by the way, that's going to aid all schools eventually, not just the ones that are submitting evidence. We've also doubled the number of reviewers. So we have 100 total reviewers, 33 from each of those entities that are going to be reviewing the evidence that's submitted. And so overall, we just feel like we've done a lot. We've new training for our reviewers, a lot of things in place to just help make this smoother and enhance the process from last year. So I just share this with you as some context so that you can see the classifications, and then as we move into the next quick discussion on designations. So in the 2017 and 18, using that data as our kind of baseline, I wanted to share with you that the classifications are a rough bell curve. So we have 13% and 12% at both ends, excellent and needs improvement. And the bulk of our schools are in the middle with great and good. I do want to share that the needs improvement, there are more needs improvement schools. And when we shared this out last year when these classifications came out, I think we made it very clear. This doesn't mean that schools have gotten worse. It means that you and us at the department have really raised the standard through our assessments, through our accountability system. And now it's incumbent upon us all to be supporting schools to reach those higher standards. So that's just a quick kind of overview. We anticipate the same rough distribution for this next year, for this fall, that we're upcoming as well. Another key thing that I want to highlight for you, and you'll notice in your slides that these are the bolded and red text here, it's just the key things for you to remember. In addition to our classifications, during this time in the fall, we also designate schools, and that's really about the support that we want to provide to our schools. So in addition to that excellent, great, good, and needs improvement classification, there's also a series of other designations that may occur. So as you know, we have 4 priority schools currently. Last year, we designated 27 comprehensive support and improvement schools. And you can see kind of the criteria that is outlined for how those were designated. And then the new piece is over on the right-hand side of your screen or of the slide, and that's about targeted support and improvement. So targeted support and improvement, those designations will come out this fall as well. And that is all about student group performance. And when I say student groups, I mean these 10 student groups, the 7 racial and ethnic student groups, economically disadvantaged students, those that receive free and reduced price lunch, English learners, and students with disabilities. So a couple quick things about this targeted support and improvement. We anticipate several schools, perhaps hundreds of schools with this designation. And so we want that to be clear to you, first, how this this designation is coming about, and also just to be aware of what we wrote into our ESSA plan, which is that italicized piece there that says, beginning in 2019, a school with that has been identified for targeted support and improvement cannot be classified as excellent. And that's really a foundational piece to our commitment for equity, in that if you have a student group that is not performing as well as the other student groups, then we don't see that you can be claimed as an excellent school. So I just wanted to make sure those pieces were clear. And then as we move into just a little highlight about the Nebraska education profile. So some of you may be curious about how the schools in your region are performing. And I would encourage you to look on the Nebraska education profile so that you can see the website right there is just nep.education.ne.gov. And that's your one-stop shop for education data. So you can download data there. There's a compare feature where you can look across And then there is just some snapshot, high-level information on there as well. And that's where the public information, the public-facing classification will be for our schools this fall. And then the last piece that I wanted to share with you, another key message, can be found on the handout in our materials, and also I shared that with you with a physical copy as well. So a few small tweaks to the AQuEST system this year, nothing super substantive. I want to highlight and stress that this is about 2 months earlier than we had our classification out last year, and we know that we can do even better this upcoming year. So we're excited to keep backing that up because we know that schools value and use this information. So we got to get it to them quicker, and we're doing a lot of work, and very thankful for our partners in NWEA and ACT, and all of the data that we're receiving has just been streamlined. We're getting processes in place to make that happen. This data will be available on the NEP as we make clear to our in our key messages document, and then we also share out exactly what I just shared about targeted support and improvement. And then on the back side of that document here, I just wanted to also make sure that you were empowered with the timelines so that you can see perhaps when you might start getting calls or when you might get concerns. And what I would just share with you is, as these timelines unfold, and if there are questions that you're receiving from your constituents, I would just encourage you to send them to me at the department. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, we want to just capture the concerns and make sure that if there's trends, we can address it in full. We also want to make sure that we're sharing the same and consistent messages to our schools and being very clear with what that data look like, what the process might look like, etc. So I hope that those three pieces, the timelines, the indicators, and the designations, and then this handout here can be helpful for you as we roll out these classifications in the fall.
Questions? Okay. Deborah first.
Could you go back to slide 8, please?
Sure. Tell me this one here?
No,
My
keep
slides.
going to the next one. That one.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure I understand, slide 9, okay. Make sure that I understand this correctly. So a school can be in a great category for all of the indicators, but if there's a vulnerable population that isn't scoring, help me understand that so I can explain that
That's
to
great.
people.
Yeah, I think you actually said that pretty well right there. So
Okay.
it's about these 10 student groups here.
Okay.
And we look at schools and we compare schools that serve that same student group.
Okay.
And we say, how are they comparing? How is that student group within that school comparing to another school that serves that same student group? And then we create a targeted list of schools that we know we need to support for targeted support and improvement for each of these student groups.
That's amazing. Okay, thank you.
Lisa, did you have a question?
Well, I was along those same lines, so you actually compare schools of like student populations first.
That's right.
And see the trend and then determine if they're targeted.
That's right. Yep.
Okay, that makes better sense to me.
And some student groups are larger than others.
Right.
For example, we have only 7 schools in the state that have 10 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students. Our largest student group is the economically disadvantaged student group, where almost 900 schools serve at least 10 students who receive free and reduced price lunch.
Patsy?
So those small marginalized groups, do they have the same effect as the other groups on whether a school can be rated as excellent?
So I want to make sure I understand your question. So
My concern.
in smaller schools, is that what you're asking, that may not have?
I'm just saying, like even in a larger school, a marginalized group or a vulnerable group can be very small. And I know as a teacher how much that can affect like test scores or whatever. But I thought I heard you say that if that group did not achieve as they should, if they were low achieving, then the school itself could not be rated as excellent.
That's right. So we look at each of the school that we are under, or that we're considering for each of these student groups. They have to serve at least 10 of those students. So for example, a school may only have 5 Asian students. So we then wouldn't consider them for targeted support and improvement for the Asian student group. But we look at the school as a whole and we say, do you have 10 Black or African American student groups? If so, we're gonna consider you for this support. And we'll look at all of these separate indicators to see if you are the lowest performing of those. Then we'll do that for that same school for the next student group and for the next student group. So a school may be identified for multiple student groups.
Can I add something just to
Yes,
this
I think
particular
Deborah
topic?
has
Sorry. So last year when I testified, with the Senate Help Committee, this is somewhat the issue where the concerns around equity and how we address equity in our state system. And when we originally did our plan, we weren't putting that type of our first iterations of our ESSA plan weren't including that type of approach where they couldn't be in the highest performing area. But it is tied to what the expectations were around ESSA. And I've had a couple different settings or environments where Senator Alexander was there, Senator Patty Murray was there, and this was, a pretty substantial type of issue that they wanted to ensure that subgroups, regardless, if everyone else was doing a great job and you had a subgroup that was never doing well, from an equity perspective, how is the state really trying to draw attention to it? And I think our approach makes very good sense given the kind of the combination of those systems, and for us to be thoughtful about that. So again, we're trying to be thoughtful about how to ensure that every student is really counted in our system, but not in an unfair way, right? Hopefully in a very fair way about how we do that. And then our real intention is, if they're identified for targeted support, that we're actually in there finding ways to help them address those particular challenges too. So I like that part of our system. I think that makes a lot of good sense, and I do think it puts us in a position that from a national level we're trying to lead on those conversations instead of sitting back and going, well, we can't do anything about it, and we do think there are things we can do.
Deborah, did you still have a question? And then Lisa.
So is that the subgroup information, is it public information? And can you look at compare school districts and graduation rates of a certain subgroup, or is that, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the NEP, you can actually dig in and drill down to some of that data. So there's an opportunity, when you search on that NEP, a school district, for example, you can click on their membership and it actually will share even greater detail, protecting student identity,
Right.
To a certain extent, right? But also showing you then graduation rates, achievement rates, attendance in some cases, those rates as well. So it really digs down. That NEP is a really powerful tool. I would encourage you all to go and explore that.
Lane, I was wondering, what would that targeted support look like? I thought the commissioner just mentioned, I guess I gleaned from what the commissioner said, there might be a staff person going in. What might that targeted support look like?
I would invite my colleague, Dr. Shirley Vargas, to come and speak to you a little bit about what we're doing and how we're thinking about some of those supports.
Hi again. So we currently have a research assistant working on creating a module that would be self-paced, self-guided with some resources such as a facilitator guide and some reflection documents that could be done at the local level in partnership with their ESUs, so that that support can be sustained over time. And it's really grounded in the mindsets, beliefs, and dispositions that are going to be important to be had in order to then really unearth what is actually causing some of the disparities that schools and districts are seeing in their own context. That's one thing. Another thing is a needs assessment tool that will be live hopefully soon, that schools and ESUs can work on together to really think about what are some of the focus areas And the document, the needs assessment tool is also aligned to our AQuESTT tenants, right? So really grounding it in what is it that we're saying is going to move the needle for our kids. And thinking about, so now we have our needs assessment, so now what do we do? So having access to things such as root cause analysis, templates, and really thinking about how our schools can engage in these conversations in a collaborative manner. Additionally, we are also thinking through what an equity summit could look like. So this is the first time saying it publicly. So it's exciting because it'll involve a real coordinated effort, and I'm excited that my colleague, Dr. Zainab, is also on board, because we really have a lot of work to do to really bring forward around what are the things when we're talking about equity, what does it really look like when it's operationalized, and what does equity look like when we're thinking about different student groups across our state that is also diverse. So that's something to look forward to. It's in the works and it's really nascent, but it's important to at least make a mention here today.
Thank you, that sounds wonderful. Is that my hand up? Robin has some, I'm gonna go to Robin for a minute, but then we'll come back.
First of all, any comments that I may make, please do not take them personal. And please understand that I respect all of the work you've done, and this is good stuff, okay? I do want you to know that. But I do have numerous thoughts or questions, I guess, that maybe you can help clarify for me. Okay, this system of what are the levels here? Help me. Excellent, great, good, and needs improvement. Okay, are those did we develop those? Did the NDE develop those? Yes. Okay. Who requires us to create levels? Is that from the federal government? Is that from the state government? Is that from both, all of the above, or what have you?
Defer to
All right. Well, I'll answer. I mean, first of all, yes to both. I mean, to a certain extent, the notion of classification levels is explicit in the state law. So, in fact, just 5.5 years ago, when LB 438 passed, it required the state board. So when you say ours, and the Nebraska Department of Education is ours collectively, the state board approved the nomenclature with the classification system. There was quite a bit of conversation at that time, and I'll share one just from your superintendent history and my interactions with superintendents at that time. I had a lot, and before we even had the names, by the way, I had a superintendent say, "So, okay, Commissioner, why don't you pick one word to describe you?" Right? I mean, so we've been through some of those histories as a state on those particular fronts that I think are important. I would actually say if I was recommending that we would think about a naming change at all, I would say what we've always tried to organize around the needs improvement name is that it really needs support for improvement, right? We've got schools that need some additional support, and I think that's probably, if there was any time that the board was able to take that up, that's probably the one part of that naming structure that I think isn't right. I went around the state at that time after the board did it. Again, it's becoming like old history almost to me now to a certain extent, and had conversations. And one of the lines I actually said, "Hey, look, I would challenge anyone in Nebraska walking their school and say it's not at least good." And we certainly have schools that might need that additional support for improvement. And that's part of what we've tried to message. And I know it's not perfect no matter what we do on that front. The other part I would just share, as we made those decisions, we've also tried to make decisions that put us in a position to continuously improve that system, and that's where we're at now as well. And I think within the kind of the scope of the law and within the scope of the federal law too, balancing those things has been a real challenge. And so, and certainly Lane and Shirley have, I don't know, it seems like you've been here forever now, and probably to you in particular. But the reality is I think we've really made some strong strides to improve that system, and credit to the committee too for always putting us in a position to think differently about how to improve that. So.
I just want to add on that a little bit also, Robin. I think that's a piece that there could be value in us coming back with an information item next month, just update, that kind of traces a little more history to see where we are today. When the state passed LB 438 and said, you shall do this, State Board of Education, you will create a classification system, we were still operating under old federal No Child Left Behind. And so one of the things I think that the board at the time felt strongly about is that if and when, and then it did happen, the feds changed, we did not want two different systems. We did not want where we were before, that we had a federal system of accountability and a state system of accountability. So with all the hard work that's happened in the department, we do have one system. Now, it's been hard to kind of massage the systems to come together. We also, when it comes to just the labeling, that was a lot of time and discussion, as my colleagues can attest to, that for the most part in Nebraska, we believe our schools, the vast majority of schools, really are doing a good, great, excellent job. But as the commissioner said, we know we have some schools that need additional supports. And that's kind of how we started the language. We, as a board, felt strongly about not using things such as A through F rating system that was encouraged and suggested. So maybe coming back and doing a little bit of a presentation on some of that history and a little more depth on how the classification process works would be of value, especially as we're coming up to it now, as you've painted the timeline, to understand, you know, the weighting process that's used for raw classification and what's in raw classification. Maybe a little more depth on that would be of value to keep building that background knowledge.
Well, and don't forget,
Microphone. Sorry.
about rating them like we rate athletic teams. That was a suggestion too.
Right. We also did not want to do a ranking. Now, I would concur that we need to move to a new evolution of change, and that's, I think, work going forward, because I do think our system still too heavily aligns with a system that's aligned to socioeconomic levels. So I do think we have some work to do to think through the system to not have as much of a correlation between a socioeconomic level and a classification level. And that's some work I think we need to do in our next, and that is what we need to do in some of our next work.
Again, I just can't emphasize enough that I want no disrespect to be taken for anything that I might be saying, because I agree, hard work has taken place. It's very obvious. And so I just cannot emphasize that enough. I looked at your the indicators, the 6 indicators, and really that's good information too. Are those weighted?
Yes. So the status and proficiency is weighted in a way as one of the more significant, and that is also a more federal guideline, is that the proficiency had to be at the highest standard or weight.
And when you say proficiency, you mean?
Are they on track or college and career ready? There's 3 benchmarks, right? 3 levels of levels of achievement in our NSCAS system, and it's, are they on track or that college and career benchmark? So the top 2.
As rated by test score?
That's right.
Okay, all right. The Bell diagram, that's a concern. Is that intentional, or is that just the way things work?
I don't know why they look at me with all the hard questions.
We've been trained.
Well, there's some history with that too. I think when you kind of have to have a starting point with this, and so statistically, and I can remember the conversations when we first started running models on this all the way back, before it was even called AQuESTT, by the way, and before we had names, is like, so what's kind of a reasonable distribution, like, and to say honestly, what's the reasonable distribution? And so there ended up being some dialogue with the state board about, okay, what is this a reasonable? What we don't want is to be fixed in that, and I think that's the difference. And the hard part is, now that we're in an annualized cycle, but every time we make a change in what that cycle might look like, you kind of come back to go, okay, is this a believable number, right? I mean, is this a number that we think we can justify based on that distribution? But I don't want to be constantly in a process where we're stuck in that. So eventually I want a system that allows, it doesn't matter, maybe we actually get to the point where we actually truly have no needs improvement schools in the state of Nebraska. I mean, that would be an ideal scenario, and we don't want a system that prevents us from having that. So we don't want to fall in the same trap that I think No Child Left Behind did. There was always some dynamic. Now, there's still a bit of that when you look at ESSA in the identification of comprehensive support and targeted support schools, because it's still saying, looking at the lowest 5%, right? But again, I want to lead with the support rather than with the label as much as we can, right? And I know it's not easy to do, but our real intention, and I think I said this right when I started as commissioner, I want a system, make sure that we have a system that before we walk into criticize, we're walking into support schools. And that's what I think we're beginning to transition. That's not easier said than done, I will say, because it's really hard to pull off that type of system from a statewide perspective. But I feel like that's what we're really building in this effort. And again, credit to our staff that worked on that. Really credit to our thinking around it from the board perspective as well.
Yeah.
I think Patsy made mention in her, the equity lens and the policy on equity and that sort of thing, talked about words such as fluid. We like to use the word living document, flexible and things like that. And so what I'm hearing is that this is still a work in progress and may always be and should be. So I'm excited about that. I'm gonna, of course, then that gives me an opportunity to provide some thoughts on what might be a little bit more flexible and fluid and living. First of all, I'm really concerned about the discussion that we've had about this, if one subgroup is consistently, and I don't know what the word consistently is defined as, but where one is consistently low, then that penalizes the entire school and saying that they cannot be excellent. I don't know, for some reason that bothers me, and I don't know the comments that were made here, if that bothers them or not, but that's something that I think really needs to be looked at.
Well, and I certainly understand your concern, but I think in starting in this process, and as the commissioner has said, we want it to be a positive experience where we are supporting them so that they move on. But I think in the beginning of this, having the information about our subgroups forces us to look at those subgroups instead of using the majority of our population as we're doing a good job. But if we've got a particular group of students that consistently, say, every year for 3 years or whatever, are not being addressed, that's not right. You know, there needs to be an effort made within the school district that they either change their methods or they change the teacher, or, you know, they find something that works for those kiddos. And if we don't recognize those subgroups and just say, oh, well, you know, the majority of all of this is just doing a great job, so they're doing fine, that's an in-service to our kids. And it may be, as the commissioner said, that, 10 years from now, we're not dealing with these subgroups like we are now. Because we've learned some new things, we've learned some new methods, we've learned from each other in our school districts, because that's another point of our classifications, is that schools can look at each other and not compare in that sense, but they can say, well, I see you're doing this. How is that affecting your students? And will you share that with me? So I think we've got to start somewhere so that those children are recognized. John?
I've just got a quick question in regards to the subgroups that we have right now. Do they go above and beyond of what is required in the Every Student Succeeds Act, or are they reflective of the act itself?
So there are actually two different sets of student groups that are under consideration. There are those that we report on. So on the NEP site, you'll actually see additional student groups that we report on. Students that have family members that are in the military,
Right.
foster care, and homeless youth.
And families that move a lot.
Highly
migrate
mobile
system,
students,
yes.
absolutely. So those are not under consideration with the targeted support and improvement, but their results on accountability, graduation, all of those pieces are reported on in the NEP.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Robin, do you still have some questions? And then we'll go to Deborah, which is fine, because we have plenty of time, and this is really important discussion. So please continue.
We're constantly reminded of that when we say things that sometimes they do not reflect the entire board. Most of what I'm saying probably falls in that area. So please keep in mind that many of these thoughts are my thoughts, okay? Flexibility, that's one of the things I was just talking about. And there's a couple of things that really indicate, show success, and I believe that there's a lot of research that backs these up. And the two things that I'm going to mention is the participation in activities. That's a very strong indicator of success in schools. And I believe that there's a way that we could measure that. There's probably a lot of data out there right now through the Nebraska School Activities Association, and so I think that would be one area that I would encourage us to think about as we think about evaluating, classifying schools. Another one is the quality and the participation level of early childhood programs, I think again that there's probably some things that could be measured from that.
Part of the EBA that they have early childhood.
The EBA, I think, is different than just some of the raw classification. I think a few of the things that Robin is suggesting are really good things to think about that fall in more of a raw classification. And so I think this discussion is really healthy, and we're going to wrap back kind of why in a different way in a few minutes. But I think that's why the discussion of what's in the EBA versus what's in raw classification can be really valuable. And I think there's probably some things that could be outside of an EBA for early childhood as well as the participation. That's a really healthy discussion, I think, for us to have. So.
And one thing that just came up, I think it's probably, this is probably coming out because I'm still a little bit dizzy from the trip that we took yesterday with the Army National Guard. But something about that ASVAB thing, I don't know if there's something we could do with that or not. I really don't know how that would fit. But like I say, that's probably just because I'm still a little dizzy. Just thank you. And again, I want to just thank you for all of your hard work. Most of which took place long before I've ever arrived here. So I just want to make sure you understand that. Thank you.
Okay, Deborah, and then Lisa, and I don't mean to keep turning my, it's like they keep raising their hand over here, so I'll look over here. Deborah,
So-
Lisa, and then.
Those of you from the eastern part of the state might know about the Empowerment Network. And every December, Willie Barney, who runs the Empowerment Network, pulls OPS data, and he looks at the subgroups. And he looks in particular at African American students. And he compares them to subgroups from other districts, like how is OPS doing to serve that population. But he also looks at how do African American students compare, like graduation rates and other indicators, you know, on the national level. And it's been exciting. He uses the data, and I know the World Herald helps him with some of the research, and you're probably very familiar with this, but it's been exciting to see. I've been going to his meetings for 10 years, and to see the improvement in the graduation rates and other academic indicators for African American students in the OPS student, because they've been able to track just that subgroup, and that's been, you know, exciting, and to see that OPS was actually doing better than some other school districts in supporting that population. But building on what Board Member Fricke had asked about, and if there is a large number of TSI students, and that's a school that has been identified as needing extra supports. I just asked this question only because in my line of work, implicit bias is everywhere, and hiring, and you know, we do a lot of training in my line of work around implicit bias, and I just wondered if that was one of the supports that NDE provides or that are provided to school districts, you know, around that topic. And if that's too controversial, you can tell me offline, or okay.
Oh, okay. So, no, we currently do not have that as a
Okay.
training that's available, but it does not mean that that's not something that we could potentially do. I also know that LPS and OPS and other districts throughout the state have offices dedicated to equity and access, and we want to make sure that the answers are typically in the room. And for the case of a state agency, the answer is in the state. So really thinking about how we can tap into engaging our different partners out in the field and how we can leverage that expertise and to bring that word throughout the state, I think would be really powerful. Really powerful.
I'm sorry.
No.
Excuse me. And I would just add that when we were thinking about the supports for our targeted support and improvement schools, we were really focused on the stuff rather than the mindsets and dispositions, as Shirley mentioned. So our module that we've been developing and getting a lot of feedback on really starts at the core of who are we as educators, and why and how do we serve different students differently, right? So it is incorporated there, but absolutely needs to be at the forefront of discussions.
Thank you.
I was just thinking that you were talking about having meetings and things like that. I'm sure some of this will come up. And I was wondering, so Commissioner, the idea of the targeted schools originated from the discussion in DC when you were there for the hearings and you adopted it. How did that come into being?
No, what I mean by that, the targeted support and improvement schools were part of ESSA already.
Oh,
But
they
the
were.
notion that if that state's accountability system should not allow the highest classification level to be offered to a school that has students that is identified for targeted support and improvement. Remember, it seems like a small percentage of groups, but when you look across multiple groups, we're going to identify a lot of different schools. But it could be deaf and hard of hearing students in a given school. It could be, visually impaired students in another. It could be based on race and ethnicity in another school. It could be based on special education needs. What we are looking for are those kind of systemic bias pieces, ultimately. And I suspect our target support is going to have to change and be evaluated based on the types of, kind of persistent issues we may have. I think we might be surprised by that, not just we as a department or we in our setting here, but also I think with school districts. And there's some things that I think there are models that could be implemented as part of that process. As we dive into that, we're gonna learn a little bit more about what those things may be. I think we've identified a very good base of what those supports can begin to look like, but there's more to do in that work. And by the way, student engagement is one of those. I would actually tell you, we might find a group of students that don't feel engaged in their setting for whatever reason, and it's not their achievement that's the issue. Or it might be the outcome that's suffering as a result. But it might be about engagement and what are our strategies in schools to help students be engaged and families feel engaged.
And then the other piece that I know will be asked is when we're targeting to make sure that the subgroup, if they need support, and then you say we're going to look at consistent deficiencies, if they're deficient or not proficient, consistently. What is that? Have you defined? Is that 2 years, 3 years? How are we going to do that?
So the consistently is a name that's directly from the law, and then the state gets to define what that consistently low performing student group means. And so we actually look at a year in time, and we look at all of those indicators for that specific student group. So we look at, is that student group, what is their proficiency compared to that same student group in another school? And if they're not at a high level of proficiency, are they at least making progress? And if they're not making progress, how are they doing in science? And are they lowering their chronic absenteeism rates? So we give a school and that student group that they're serving several chances or several opportunities to show that they're serving and moving in the right direction for that specific student group. But we're really looking at that snapshot in time, this 1 year of data.
1 year of data.
Okay, so back to this committee report that we haven't even given the report yet. We're going to try to tie this together, and I'm going to ask you guys to stay on this, and we may call Brad up, I'm not sure yet, or Ryan in this wrapping together here. So the 3.7.C was a discussion item, and I'm going to talk about it and then start to weave these things together. And that discussion item was regarding changes to board policy S2, accountability for quality education system today and tomorrow, AQuESTT. That has been one of the catalysts for discussion in our committee about how we move forward. We are making a recommendation to the policy committee on S2 that the policy committee will get for next month. And in that, we really do some redefining of AQuESTT, not significantly, but in a way that I think strengthens from the conversations even today. And that adds a leadership element around AQuESTT. And it starts to move into maybe discussion around student achievement rather than just assessment in when we talk about AQuESTT. So those proposed changes will be in front of you next month. There are also 3 key concepts that are framed in the position statement. And the purpose of the position statement will be to help us move forward in some of our regulatory work. Those 3 key elements are around approval, and that links to Rule 14, accreditation, which links to Rule 10, and accountability, which also links to Rule 10. So our committee has been spending quite a bit of time on these concepts, also from the recommendation of the legislative committee on those priorities. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about those concepts, and if you have questions, that's why it's kind of like the whole team, the NDE team being here and the committee. We're looking at really defining some key themes around accreditation to come forward so that when we talk about what are some of the things we need to do around accreditation, that we have a strong understanding of what some of that transformation around Ryan just added something that okay, so it moves to that support system a little bit more as well on that position that we're taking for S2. So around accreditation, looking towards building on the strength in accreditation around continuous improvement process and that correlation between some student achievement, which is not new for our schools. Our schools have continuous improvement. How do we saw good examples of continuous improvement in Santee this week, and how we move forward. So building accreditation on that foundation, and on the foundation that it's a standards-based or performance-based accreditation process. And so elements of that are currently in Rule 10. It's really bringing those up maybe a little bit to the forefront. Another discussion point will be, right now we accredit districts, and it'll be moving into a discussion of should we accredit schools? And if so, what might that look like, and what might that process look like? How do we make sure that in our accreditation process we have some flexibility and innovation? How do we ensure that those elements are there? And then maybe how do we create an approach that if a school is in need of greater support, maybe their accreditation cycle is a little shorter. If a school does not need much support, maybe their accreditation cycle is a little longer. Those are some of the key concepts that we're working on, fleshing out details around accreditation. Right now we have accountability and accreditation merged in Rule 10. One element of discussion is, do we try to separate those out a little bit more in Rule 10? Maybe they're in two separate rules. I'm not sitting here saying this is what the committee feels strongly it needs to be. These are the topics and discussion the committee's having that will be imperative for the full board to be engaged in this discussion. Around accountability, some of the discussion has been a need to certainly look at, are there some key improvements that we need to look at in our classification? And Robin, you brought up some great examples. That discussion needs to be integrated into, are there some improvements in the system that we need to make? Are there some additional indicators of some sort? Are there some changes on the EBA that we need to take a look at? Do we need to look at growth in a different way? And I think from Lisa's committee, there'll be some things around assessment that'll come forward that may paint the picture a little differently for us to think about how assessment fits into this process. And so what are some of those key elements that we need to look at? And then there's another piece that we have discovered that we think is really missing that needs to be defined in rule, and that is a little more around kind of that system of support thinking, but in particular around our priority schools, and that's what are some of the guidelines for our priority school plans? Should we spell some of those things out in rule a little more clearly so we're very transparent about that? In LB 438, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it indicates that if a priority school has not made progress in 3 years, then we may put into place some sort of, I believe the language is alternative administrative structure. Well, what's that? We haven't defined that. So that's a part of our accountability system. We need to really define what does that mean and how do we look at that in some perspective, and probably again put that in a rule so everyone understands what it is and sees what it is. So those would be kind of the accreditation and the accountability piece. The third piece of this is around approval. And initial discussion have been to really start to look at a lot of items in Rule 10 that are statutory items that are very much an item of compliance that maybe should be more an item of approval. So if you have to have a policy on dating violence, I'm trying to think of what some of those are. Instead of putting all of those kinds of statutory compliance items in a Rule 10, maybe they're a part of Rule 14 for approval, and every year there's assurances that you've got this checklist of things that are statutorily required in your school, and maybe they're kind of checked as a part of the accreditation visit and process, but maybe they're more approval items than they are accreditation items. So all of these are really significant changes as we start to think about how do we transform these rules. We also have had discussion of making sure at the same time we talk about how Rule 84 and accreditation of ESUs kind of goes hand in hand in this process. We don't lose sight of, are there changes we should look at for accreditation of ESUs as we're looking at these processes. So the first step of this will be that position statement to help guide the discussion. The next part of this is also looking at how do we involve stakeholder engagement in a different way. We have an opportunity right now with Perkins and the Perkins State Plan, an opportunity and a requirement to ensure that we have some stakeholder engagement in a multitude of ways. And there's several things already happening for stakeholder engagement. But one of the things as a committee we've discussed is hosting a town hall meeting that's a board-hosted town hall meeting that will be a part of stakeholder engagement. And that town hall meeting will be for the purpose of gathering input in the fall of 2019 around several items. One will be Perkins 5 in the state plan, and we've got several items there that we'll put together and talk about. The others are these concepts of accreditation, accountability, and approval. Before we move too far into the actual development of transformation of those rules, how do we go out and seek some input from our constituents, from our key stakeholders? And in doing so, some states use a type of board-driven town hall process. And so one of the elements we've talked about this fall, being probably in October or November, for each board member to have at least one town hall. Some of us who have larger geographic areas may want to have more than one town hall because of, where we are. But again, it be really hosted by a board member for their particular geographic region. And we'll be working on detailing that out here over the next month as we move forward with those proposed recommendations from this committee. Ryan, do you have anything else on the stakeholder engagement piece to add? And did I capture committee, staff, kind of everything we've talked about over the past 2 months in depth?
Yeah.
Okay, then I think that ends our lengthy report. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much, ma'am. We'll continue on with the committee report, board reports, dates, and discussion items. Thank you for submitting your monthly report. Board member reports are linked in Spark. I encourage you to review each member's report. Members now will share briefly about one event or activity they participated in within the last 3 months. And if you would give a quick, brief summary, we'll start with Pat Tim.
Well, the one thing that I attended was yesterday when we had our Early Childhood Commission meeting. And we're coming to the end of the 3 years of the commission being in meeting. We have had 40 members. A couple of them have, of course, retired and gone on to other things or aren't with us anymore. We do have a couple of members that, even though they've retired, have said they're going to stick it out till the end because they've been there long enough, they want to see how it ends. We have received a first draft of the report out. It's being called an action plan, and which I was appreciative of, because so many times when we have groups that meet for a long time, then they do a little report and an executive summary, and we hand it out and it ends up on the shelf. But these are recommendations, and there will be more discussion between now and December, and then there will also be another meeting, the 4th of December, where we will finalize. The recommendations, the action plan will be revealed publicly in January.
Thank you, Pat. Robin?
Thank you, President. The thing that jumped out at me when you asked that question, I went to ESU 15 and ESU 16. Actually, it was a joint meeting in Ogallala. And I bring this up because it was one of the things that we discussed in our legislative meeting today, and their concern about what's going to happen with ESUs. And some of the, I know that there is a study out there that the legislature is going to have on ESUs, and they're very concerned about that, and rightfully so.
Thank you, sir. Deb?
Thank you. I was able to attend a showing of the documentary called No Small Matters, along with, I know President Witzel was there. Who was the other? Was it you?
Oh, I
Who else
attended
joined us?
it, but not
Oh,
that
okay.
time.
Oh, okay. I forget. Anyway, along with some West Side school board members and new West Side teachers, and it was a documentary about just the importance of early childhood education. It really,
It is.
oh my gosh, highly recommend
the
it.
military part
So,
was
yes.
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Lisa?
Well, I had the opportunity with Board Member Witzel to go to the Monroe Meyer groundbreaking ceremony, and the amazing charitable people who donated to make that possible. They do so many things for challenged students, or children actually, and their families. And I went to the luncheon, and sitting at my table was, well, to explain, it was like our students sometimes appear to be a little broken, in quotes, challenged, but with the resources and help that they get, they become some, valuable people to society. They already are, but you make them better. Well, what this was, these students, I think about it, they were like the broken pieces of glass that these students used for this at the table. And I tried to get, I offered to buy one for each of you, just because of the story that goes with it, to remind us that everybody deserves the chance to be the best that they can. And these kids took broken glass and made something so beautiful. And what they told me when I asked, these are already spoken for, because there were a lot of them left on the tables, and I said, can I buy some for the board members and the commissioner? And they said, not at this time, but when their shop opens in their new place, I can go buy them. So anyway, that was really touching, that we need to remember these kids they just need the resources that they need to get where they can be. And this was from broken glass to be something so beautiful, and so are the students that we work for. So anyway, that was impressive for me.
Rachel?
Just quickly, I've talked a lot already about Santee and our visit there, which was fabulous. And NASB is coming up, which is great. And thank you again for the Black Hawk excursion and for really getting a great update on what the Guard's doing. So that was good.
Patsy?
I'm having the opportunity to work with Senator Bowles and a group of other interested people on a project called Turn It Up, which is sort of like a TEDx for people, students with disabilities. And we're in the process of looking at possible presenters, and there'll be all kinds of ways to present, and choosing them. And then what I'm most excited about is working with them one-on-one on however they decide to present, whether it's through music or through a speech or a performance. And so I'm so grateful to Senator Bowles for thinking about me and asking me to be a part of it.
Maureen?
Well, I go back to the middle of July. I was part of a panel presentation with other board members at NSCAU's summer professional growth time for teachers and members across the state. I found it to be very interesting. There was, Ryan did a great job of I think there were 6 of us well, there were 6 total that participated, but Ryan broke us up into 2 groups of 3 so that we weren't in a forum. But what I learned from those that were in the room, and it was a pretty full room, was they really want their voices heard at the table. They don't feel like they're being heard. And I think we were able to put it back on them that their voices can be heard through their local school board and to be involved with that. The thing that probably stood out the most was that they came to realize that equity and access and resources was a major issue, and that we needed to be working with all students in our schools. And not everyone has the access that other districts do, but I very much enjoyed it. It was good to be around them.
Thank you, Vice President Nichols. Thank you, ma'am. I was very proud and honored to represent the State Board of Education at the 75th anniversary of the GI Bill, and it was at the National Forum in downtown Omaha. I was honored to read, and they were very responsive and very, very proud to receive the proclamation that the board created for that particular event. And it was very, very well accepted, and many thanks. Also, I was able to participate on a forum with individuals that have used the GI Bill in the past, and all ages. And it's just amazing to see how the GI Bill had changed so many lives in the past few years. And it was just a very glowing moment. I was proud to represent each and every one of you at this event. Thank you. Thank you. Lisa was there with us, and we had a good time. We'll continue on with our agenda. Tomorrow, we will vote on requests to approve attendance at meetings that took place in the past and were not previously approved. There are 5 members requesting meeting approvals. The requests for future meeting attendance travel from board members are linked in Spark meetings. Tomorrow, we will approve the board request for meeting attendance. The monthly board travel expense report is attached in Spark meetings for your review. Adjournment. The regularly scheduled meeting of the State Board of Education will reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning in this room. We are adjourned. Thank you.